Europe just crossed a line it thought would end a chapter, but instead reopened the entire book. The decision to sever Russian gas by 2027 was presented as a clean break, a moral and strategic closure to a painful dependency. But the moment the ink dried, the consequences started moving faster than the policy itself. What Brussels framed as unity immediately exposed a deeper fracture about who actually holds power inside the Union. This is not a story about pipelines or molecules of gas. It is about authority, consent, and the limits of centralized control in a bloc built on national sovereignty. For years, the EU has relied on the assumption that once a crisis is labeled existential, members will fall in line. That assumption no longer holds. Countries on the energy periphery hear a different message than those at the core. For capitals that heat homes and power factories with Russian supply, the ban feels less like strategy and more like an order handed down from afar. Hungary's reaction made that clear. The pushback was not quiet, procedural, or symbolic. It was open defiance, paired with a simple claim that energy security is national survival, not a technocratic checkbox. The deeper tension is that the EU tried to resolve a political conflict with administrative speed. By compressing debate and treating energy as a trade adjustment rather than a security shock, Brussels underestimated the emotional and economic asymmetry across member states. That miscalculation turned a policy announcement into a loyalty test. Once framed that way, resistance becomes rational. When people feel ordered rather than persuaded, they stop negotiating details and start questioning legitimacy. This is why the backlash matters far beyond gas. It reveals a union struggling to reconcile urgency with consent. The thesis is straightforward. The gas cutoff did not unify Europe. It forced every member to answer an old question under new pressure. Who decides when national risk becomes collective obligation? The answer is no longer obvious, and the silence around that ambiguity is what turned a technical decision into a political rupture. To understand how this escalated so quickly, you have to look at the mechanism Brussels used to push the decision through. The gas ban was not framed as a security action, even though it directly affects national resilience, industrial output, and winter heating. It was categorized as a trade and regulatory measure. That distinction is not semantic. In the EU system, security decisions require unanimity, which gives every member a veto. Trade measures do not. By choosing this legal lane, EU leadership could move faster and avoid being blocked by dissenting capitals. On paper, it was efficient. In reality, it was combustible. When governments realized that a decision with national survival implications was passed without their full consent, trust eroded instantly. The speed that Brussels celebrated became the proof its critics needed. This is where the logic broke. Energy is not evenly distributed across Europe. Some countries diversified early, invested heavily, and absorbed higher costs. Others built systems around stable pipeline supply. Treating those differences as irrelevant created a perception of unfair sacrifice. The message received in Budapest and Bratislava was not shared responsibility, but imposed risk. Once that perception sets in, the debate shifts from policy outcomes to procedural legitimacy. That is the dangerous zone for any union. Because when process feels manipulated, even reasonable goals trigger backlash. Brussels assumed the urgency of geopolitics would override institutional sensitivities. Instead, it exposed them. The error was believing that legal authority could substitute for political buy-in. It cannot. The more complex the union, the more essential consent becomes. By bypassing veto rules, the EU did not remove resistance. It concentrated it. And concentrated resistance looks like rebellion. The lesson here is structural. Rules are not neutral. How a decision is made can matter more than what the decision is. In this case, the chosen mechanism transformed an energy strategy into a constitutional dispute about power sharing inside Europe. Hungary's response was not emotional, it was calculated. Faced with a decision it could not stop directly, Budapest reached for the most effective tool available to a smaller member state inside a large institution: delay. The legal challenge announced by Hungary is often misunderstood as a gamble to win in court. That misses the point. The objective is not victory years from now, it is paralysis today. Energy policy runs on timelines. Infrastructure, contracts, and investment decisions are all sensitive to uncertainty. By contesting the legal basis of the gas ban, Hungary introduces exactly that uncertainty. The argument is simple. If cutting off gas constitutes a security decision, then the EU used the wrong procedure and violated member rights. Whether judges ultimately agree is secondary. What matters is that the clock keeps ticking while the case crawls forward. This is asymmetric power in action. Hungary cannot outvote the EU, but it can slow it down. And in a system built on deadlines, slowing down is power. The delay forces other governments to reassess their own tolerance for risk. As the 2027 target approaches, political courage tends to fade. Industrial lobbies grow louder. Voters feel price pressure. Allies who were confident on day one begin to hedge. This is why the lawsuit matters. It converts time into leverage. It also sends a signal to other dissatisfied members that resistance does not require confrontation. It requires patience and procedural fluency. The second-order effect is corrosive. Once delay becomes normalized, collective action weakens. Every future decision becomes vulnerable to obstruction. Hungary is not just defending its energy mix, it is redefining the balance of power between center and periphery. In modern alliances, the strongest weapon is often the ability to make action expensive, slow, and politically exhausting. That is the playbook now in motion. The confrontation inside Europe would already be destabilizing on its own, but the dynamic changed the moment an external actor entered the equation. Hungary's defiance stopped looking isolated when signals from Washington began to align with Budapest's position. Reports surrounding high-level meetings and policy exemptions revealed something critical. The United States was willing to grant Hungary temporary flexibility on Russian energy transactions, even as Brussels pushed for absolute separation. That move reframed the entire standoff. Hungary was no longer facing the EU alone. It had a safety net outside the bloc. This matters because energy pressure only works when alternatives are closed. By keeping one channel open, Washington reduced the cost of resistance. This was not a symbolic gesture, it was operational leverage. For Hungary, it meant continued access, price stability, and bargaining room. For Brussels, it meant loss of monopoly control over compliance. The deeper implication is geopolitical. Alliances are no longer sealed containers. Members can shop for external backing when internal rules become restrictive. That reality undermines enforcement without firing a single shot. The United States did not need to confront the EU directly, it simply adjusted its own sanctions posture and altered the payoff structure. Suddenly, defiance was survivable. This created a parallel axis of influence that bypassed Brussels entirely. The message was subtle but unmistakable. Loyalty inside the bloc is conditional when external guarantees exist. This is where cohesion erodes. When members realize they can hedge against collective decisions, unity becomes negotiable. The energy dispute thus expanded into a broader question about Western alignment. If Washington and Brussels are not perfectly synchronized, smaller states will exploit the gap. Hungary's calculation was clear. With external tolerance secured, internal resistance became rational. The EU discovered that its power rests not only on rules but on exclusivity. Once that exclusivity breaks, enforcement weakens. This episode demonstrates how global power competition now operates through exemptions and loopholes rather than overt confrontation. Faced with a member state openly resisting and an external actor quietly enabling that resistance, Brussels began discussing options that would have been unthinkable just years ago. The conversation shifted toward altering the very rules that define collective decision-making. At the center of this debate is the unanimity principle. For decades, this rule ensured that no country could be forced into sanctions it considered existentially dangerous. It was the price of unity. Now it is being reconsidered as an obstacle. Some leaders argue that allowing one or two states to block action leaves the entire union vulnerable. Their proposed solution is majority voting on sanctions. On the surface, this looks like efficiency. In reality, it is a structural gamble. Removing veto power changes the nature of the union itself. It transforms membership from voluntary coordination into enforced alignment. That may solve short-term paralysis, but it introduces long-term fragility. Countries that feel overridden do not suddenly become compliant. They become resentful. The legitimacy of decisions erodes when consent is replaced by arithmetic. This is the paradox Brussels now faces. To preserve unity, it considers measures that could permanently fracture trust. The gas dispute accelerated this dilemma. What began as an energy question now threatens constitutional balance. Smaller states see the proposed rule change as confirmation of their fears, that Brussels will adjust procedures whenever outcomes are inconvenient. This perception fuels further resistance. The EU risks entering a feedback loop where stronger enforcement triggers stronger backlash. The irony is that the more aggressively the center pushes, the more peripheral states seek external anchors. This is not abstract theory, it is political psychology. When institutions stop protecting minorities, minorities stop believing in institutions. The talk of majority voting is a signal of desperation rather than confidence. It reveals that the current framework is under strain. Changing the rules may deliver immediate results, but it also redraws the social contract that held the union together. Beneath the procedural battles lies a quieter but more consequential shift in European power dynamics. For decades, the EU functioned through an informal leadership engine anchored by France and Germany. When Paris and Berlin aligned, policy momentum followed. That model is now faltering. The gas crisis exposed how limited that influence has become. Central and Eastern European states are no longer passive followers. They have learned how to use institutional rules to amplify their voice. Hungary and Slovakia are not anomalies. They represent a broader regional confidence that did not exist a generation ago. Economic growth, political consolidation, and strategic positioning have changed the internal balance. The result is a union that no longer moves in one direction by default. Every major decision now requires negotiation across competing blocs with different threat perceptions and economic tolerances. This slows action and complicates messaging. From the outside, Europe appears indecisive. From the inside, it feels fragmented. That perception has consequences. Allies question reliability. Markets price in uncertainty. Rivals exploit hesitation. The gas dispute did not create these trends, but it accelerated them. It demonstrated that leadership by assumption no longer works. Authority must be earned repeatedly. The EU is transitioning from a hierarchical model to a bargaining arena. That transition is messy and unstable. It reduces the ability to project power quickly. It also forces compromises that dilute strategic clarity. This is not necessarily collapse. It is transformation. But transformation carries risk. When leadership structures weaken before new ones stabilize, the system becomes vulnerable to shocks. Energy policy exposed this vulnerability because it touched daily life and national survival. The deeper lesson is that integration without shared risk tolerance is brittle. Europe is discovering that unity is harder to maintain when costs are unevenly distributed. The old engine has stalled, and no replacement is ready. That uncertainty defines the current moment. The shockwaves from Europe's internal struggle do not stop at its borders. They ripple outward into global energy markets, financial flows, and strategic planning rooms far beyond Brussels. As Europe scrambles to replace Russian gas, demand pressure intensifies everywhere else. Liquefied natural gas cargoes are finite, infrastructure is uneven, and contracts lock in supply years ahead. When Europe enters the market as a desperate buyer, prices do not just rise locally, they reset globally. This reordering elevates supplier states into new positions of leverage. Countries once treated as transactional partners suddenly find themselves holding strategic keys. Long-term contracts now carry political weight alongside price tags. At the same time, capital markets react faster than diplomats. Investors interpret fragmentation as risk. When policy coherence weakens, uncertainty gets priced in. Borrowing costs creep upward, industrial expansion slows. Capital seeks predictability, not promises. This is where the shift becomes visible. Funds begin flowing toward regions perceived as insulated from European political turbulence. Neutral hubs gain appeal. Asian markets with stable energy planning and clearer governance structures look comparatively attractive. This is not a judgment on Europe's values. It is a reflection of how money responds to volatility. The deeper effect is strategic. A divided Europe becomes less central as an anchor of the global system. Partners diversify exposure, supply chains are redesigned to minimize reliance on any single bloc facing internal strain. None of this requires hostility. It happens quietly through contracts, investments, and risk models. The gas dispute accelerates a trend already underway. The world is moving toward a more distributed balance, where influence is shared across multiple centers, rather than concentrated in one or two. Europe's difficulty in enforcing unity speeds that transition. In attempting to assert control, the Union inadvertently signals limitation. Others adapt accordingly. The global system adjusts not out of spite, but out of prudence. At this point, the path forward breaks into several possible trajectories, none of them clean. In the first scenario, Brussels pushes through resistance, rewrites voting rules, and enforces the gas cutoff on schedule. Europe appears decisive, but internal trust erodes. Compliance is achieved at the cost of cohesion. In the second scenario, delays compound. Legal challenges, political hesitation, and economic pressure stretch timelines until the 2027 target quietly dissolves. The policy remains on paper while reality diverges underneath it. In the third and most counterintuitive scenario, the Union recalibrates. Instead of forcing alignment, it negotiates flexibility, accepts uneven pacing, and preserves legitimacy by absorbing compromise. This path looks weaker in headlines but stronger structurally. Which outcome prevails depends less on ideology than on tolerance for risk and patience. The gas crisis was never just about energy. It exposed fault lines between speed and consent, authority and legitimacy, unity and diversity. The attempt to close one chapter opened several others simultaneously. Europe now stands at a threshold where every move carries trade-offs that cannot be hidden by procedure. The broader lesson extends beyond the continent. In a world of fragmented power, endurance matters more than dominance. Systems that survive are those that adapt without breaking their own foundations. This episode has already reshaped expectations about how alliances function under pressure. The era of automatic alignment is fading. What replaces it will be noisier, slower, and more transactional. The question is whether that world can still deliver stability. So here's what I want to ask you. Does Europe emerge stronger by enforcing unity, even when it divides its members, or by accepting limits and preserving trust at the cost of speed? And more broadly, are we watching the temporary turbulence of transition, or the permanent erosion of a system built for a different era? Let me know what you think in the comments below. Stay safe. Be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.